So again, thank you for coming, and thanks to my friends from Purina for the invitation. I'm certainly glad to be involved myself. So what I chose to do with this particular presentation is talk about many of the studies that actually have shown any positive clinical effects. Again, as you know, compared to humans, we actually don't have nearly as many well-designed clinical trials for veterinary studies with probiotics of any companies. Did choose to not be Purina only, so I'll show some studies from other probiotics as well, just to support the concept that the future with manipulating the body, both locally as well as potentially systemically with probiotics, the future actually looks positive to me, and I've been glad to be involved with that type of work. Now, I think of the speakers other than Ebenezer, who actually works for Purina, I probably should give you a little bit of a disclosure. My Center for Companion Animal Studies is a nonprofit that I use there at Colorado State, and our mission is really to support research by young people. But one of the ways to get research dollars for young people is obviously working with great companies like Purina. And there have been several times that the American economy was in the dumpster, in the trash can, that Purina helped save something. For example, we had one of our dermatologists change universities while we had no money. They froze the position so we couldn't refill it. And if it wasn't for Purina, I think our dermatologist would have probably quit. So again, it's easy to want to be supportive, but I hope that this lecture is unbiased, even though they do lots of things, because I would only like to talk about things that are published, not just feelings today. And unfortunately, we do end up with a lot of the probiotic space. A lot of those companies, since there's almost no regulation with probiotics, or honestly any nutraceutical, basically very little regulation, at least in the Americas, you can make the prettiest figures that have actually no data at all. They look great, and then people want to buy it because the marketing people are brilliant, but they may or may not have any backup data. And that's what's so inspiring, honestly, about the Purina Institute that wants to do their work and support the sciences. So we're going to hit a number of key points. I'll bring the slide up at the end one more time at the end of the talk, but hopefully I'll have some information that's of interest to you guys. First thing, maybe I'll ask Jan, since we're good friends. Jan, do I have the labels correct? The good versus bad? Yeah, I think we would all agree that if you could get off the toilet faster, right? We're all going to have diarrhea again in our life, I'm sure. And if I can get off the toilet faster, that's a win. And so I am very interested in nutraceuticals, dietary management, and non-antibiotic pathways. I was pleased to see no one raise their hand about using antibiotics for acute diarrheas anymore. Or at least you were too shy to raise your hands. But doing that with probiotics and diet, and then only need antibiotics occasionally for rescue things, or true antibiotic responsive diseases like tylosin responsive enteropathies. Obviously, we're not going to stop using antibiotics in our life. But if we can speed resolution of an acute diarrhea without metronidazole or tylosin, that's probably going to have long-term good effects because of that dysbiosis that Jan so eloquently showed us today. So we know the definition, so I won't bore you with that anymore. But what I think I learned, and for me, it started in 2003, was the first time I was involved directly in probiotic research. I hate to age myself, but in 1980, I was a third-year veterinary student. And you might remember that year was when parvo in the dog swept the world. And so I did have the opportunity to work on parvo puppies quite early in my career. I think in 1980, as a third year, I think I was 12 years old that year. So, but what I learned from that practitioner, his name is Charles Gray, really nice man, he is still alive. He, towards the end of the recovery phase of parvo puppies, when they were having diarrhea, he actually gave them feces from normal dogs as a milkshake, a fecal milkshake. And so I actually got involved with fecal microbiome transplants in 1980. I thought the guy was crazy. And now it turns out maybe he wasn't. But what I got excited about when I got to meet Ebenezer and Jaleel and some other folks from the Nestle Center in Lausanne, Christophe, I met these guys at an international meeting a number of years ago, I think 2002. And they said, hey, Mike, you do some cat immunology work. Would you be interested in looking at the effects of one of our new probiotics? And I'm like, what's a probiotic? Really, it wasn't part of my life. I'm mainly an infectious disease researcher. But I read one of their preprints, the first paper on using SS68, the probiotic that Purina has in Fortiflora around the world. I'll show you the paper a little bit later. But they showed me this paper where puppies that were vaccinated and fed this probiotic long-term maintained higher distemper titers than puppies that were fed the control. And it was interesting. You obviously don't probably need probiotics to make vaccines work, but it proved the hypothesis that some probiotics, via their interaction with the microbiome, could actually be immune modulators. In that case, it was immune modulating up on B lymphocytes. Didn't have a lot of T cell effects in that first paper, but again, that was a number of years ago. So again, as we get into today's discussion, I wanted to give you just an overview of some of the positive gastrointestinal studies, and then end up with a couple of the studies that I believe prove that at least this particular probiotic, SS68 strain of Enterococcus faecium, can be a pro-immune modulator. And then I'll also show you some data today about other probiotics that can potentially dampen immune responses or help treat things like inflammatory bowel disease or perhaps even atopy for our token dermatologist in the room. So first thing, as we go through the exhibit hallway tomorrow and the next days for ECVIM, is just remember that anytime you see another company marketing a probiotic, that the first question to ask them is to show me your data on your shelf life. You know, they'll make a claim for how long the shelf life is, but my first question is always, I'd like to see the data proving that your claimed shelf life, the bacteria are actually alive at that level. And as you know, when we first started doing that type of work in America with both of Scott Weiss's papers from Canada, it was amazing that at least in North America, most of the products didn't even come close to meeting their label claims. So that's my first step. And then to make it a little bit USA-centric, in the USA, I believe that these three products are the ones that I would personally potentially buy for different uses in practice. And that was based initially on the fact that they tend to meet their label claim, and they do provide quantitative culture results, the two Fortiflora products, the one for dogs and the one for cats. Visbiome Vet, if you haven't been following this literature, that was the old VLS number 3 that now is a veterinary product. And Jan's been involved in at least 2 studies with that particular probiotic grouping of bacteria. And then our friends at Nutramax, they actually a high quality company. They tend to do things like at least prove that they meet their label claim. So congrats to those guys. But honestly, if you look at then the amount of data from any one product, or at least even one bacterium, in this case SS68 and Fortiflora, there is a wealth of information with that particular product. And so kudos to these guys isolating that bacterium 68 from a baby. You know, that bacterium's been around quite some time, and over 100 different studies have been looked at. So one of the things that I always talk about when people ask me, it is the American way, more is better. You know, we're in a country of excess. Most of us are twice as big as we should be. But it's not necessarily proven to be true, especially when it comes to probiotic bacterial numbers. You know, more seems better, and then the human papers sometimes say that, but it's often not based on a lot of data. And so what I actually like to see, I don't care how many bacterial numbers they have in a product, I like to see clinical response data. Because if it works at 500 million, that's fine with me. So again, back to numbers of bacteria, the one bacterium. And then this whole thing about having more strains of bacteria being better. Well, there's a little bit of work in the United States, but in people comparing some of the multi-strain type things. But if you really think about if you're going to use the word better, doesn't that imply you had to do a comparison? Better than? Well, show me a veterinary probiotic paper that compared amongst products. You know, they don't usually like to fund that type of work, right? They don't want to, even in a positive control way, you know, where you have a good probiotic compared to another probiotic. Neither of the companies want to fund that because it just shows them equivalency and the odds if they're pretty good bacteria, they may or may not be able to show a difference. So it is a little bit tough, I think, when people ask me, hey, Mike, do you think Nutramax is better than Fortiflora, for example? And I say, I don't know, better means they had to be compared. I don't know any comparison studies. So right now, I'm just, very blunt, especially to practitioner level folks in America. Ask that exhibitor, show me your stability data. And 2, have you done any controlled study, hopefully outside your building? And if they haven't done that, at least something inside their building, some sort of data. And as you guys know, it's actually pretty slim. And it's a shame because they're making a lot of money selling probiotics. So it'd be nice to see them turn some of that back into published research. So kudos for these guys because they actually have. Here's my very first one that I did in the cat infectious disease world. And I'll show you the herpes part of it towards the end. This paper is getting a little bit long in the tooth now. I think it's about 10 years old. We've been following up. I see our Spanish friends there. A cat practitioner has been working with Fortiflora in the field for herpes kitties. But in that immune modulating study that I'll show you, we did have an effect. We couldn't wake up herpes nearly as well if they were in the Fortiflora room versus the placebo room when we caused stress. And the stress model that we use, because Purina won't allow us to give them Depomedrol. As a herpes researcher, what I would normally do is give them herpes. Then once their signs quieted down, I'd give half of them the product, half of them the placebo. And after the appropriate time, I'd just give them a big old dose of methylprednisolone acetate. Great model for herpes reactivation. But kudos to the Purina people and their animal ethics boards. You can't do that. However, we weren't able to change their stress levels by changing their housing. So our research rooms are quite nice, lots of perches, visual shields so the cats can hide from each other, lots of ping pong balls. We always match the number of ping pong balls between rooms. The point is we're trying to give the similar enrichment between rooms, and then the stress is from being in the gang room, and then within your same room in the cages. So gang room cages, and that's enough to reactivate herpes. And it's also enough to change your microbiome. That amount of stress can change your microbiome, and we could block that out by feeding Fortiflora. So I believe that particular bacterium has at least one published cat study looking at microbiome and the fact that it does probably change that microbiome in the face of stress. There's a lot of talk about antibiotics already today, and this is a great example for when you want to do shelter research in the United States. You kind of have to work with the shelter vet. They're in charge. In this particular study, I could not talk them out of giving every dog with diarrhea metronidazole. It was like, nope, we use metronidazole in our shelter diarrhea. And I said, well, let's turn those lemons into lemonade and asked them if I could just give half the dogs the probiotic and then the other half got the placebo. And by the way, as I go through the rest of the talk, all the Purina ones that I'll mention, they don't send us the product in the sachets. They send the product to me in capsules. And so some of the capsules have a red dot. The other capsules have no dot. And I don't know what's in the capsules. And so it's truly double-blinded, everything that I'll share with you. The people that are doing the scoring, either fecal or respiratory scoring, they're also blinded to which room is getting red dot versus no dot. And what we do, as I'm sure you guys do as scientists, what we do, even though you're always wanting it to work, I think all scientists want the project to work, but point is you should ignore all of that until you finish the statistics. And that's what I encourage my graduate students to do. You just do the work. We don't work for Purina. Do the work, break the code at the end. If it worked, fine. And so that's what this study was. If you guys don't remember this one, we design them all as pilot studies. Our animal care and use will usually let us do a client-owned animal, which we consider shelter animals to be client-owned. They'll let us have 16 usually per group if we have no idea if the substance is going to work or not. They'll let us have a small number. And then after the data is finished, if there's a positive response, we may or may not go ahead and publish it. And if there are statistical trends, which I know is a dirty word to statistics people, but if there are numerical differences, but it didn't achieve statistical difference, then we can do a power calculation, do a larger study. But that's what we did in this study. And the shelter staffing, it's hard to split the probiotic from feeding, and which would be the feeding probiotic versus, say, the antibiotic. So the first thing we did in this particular study is actually show that FS68 is resistant to metronidazole. And so if you are going to use this probiotic, you can probably give it concurrently, which is what we did in this study. But it was a fun little study, and I don't want to belabor it. The data is not gigantic, but when we did look at overall fecal character amongst the two groups over the course of the study, we right at the edge for statistical significance. And if you are reviewers, thanks for the kind comments. We haven't had any letters to the editor, so it looks to me like, hey, pretty well accepted study, albeit a little bit small. This is a great European one that you might have seen recently, and if you're in the audience, congratulations for that particular one. It was used a design that we had used previously in a shelter study, and it was another just evidence that some probiotics might actually do something, so congrats to them. And then the Visbiome vet, Jan's on this particular paper as well. This was kind of fun because I think most Europeans and Americans, we believe that Clostridium perfringens can overgrow during periods of stress or diet change and make animals sick. I actually believe those increased toxin productions are real. And so this was a nice science-based paper showing some positive response. Here's that cat paper. I always call it a cat paper, but we actually did dogs in this paper as well. We just couldn't report a positive response to the probiotic in the dog part of this paper, because one of the things that I learned, and you guys are probably smarter than me, this shelter was one of the ones that was feeding donated foods. So they just dump the bags into big 55-gallon drums, and they push those drums of food throughout the shelter, scooping out these mixed foods. Well, the first thing we do in a study like this is want to control for diet, right? So that's how this study started, is we'll put all the animals on a standardized diet. And that alone, and it happened to be a Purina product, and it was a Fortiflora study, just putting all the dogs in the shelter on a standardized diet, dropped their diarrhea rates so low that we couldn't tease out any difference in the probiotic. However, since cats are a lot more prone to the stress thing, we still had over 20% of the cats in the shelter at the start of the study. Over 20% of them still had diarrhea for at least 2 days or longer, and that's what we were able to assess. As you might guess, shelter work is also hard because often a small one like this shelter, they didn't actually have 2 stray rooms. You know, they weren't big enough that I could just do 2 stray rooms. And so I had to use the feral room to compare to the stray room. And we would always argue a cat that you can't touch. That's what they usually call feral in the United States. They're obviously often, I would presume they have more stress anyway, since they're trying to kill me. Not sure that's true, but then we could also argue that the stray room, which was closer to the dog runs, and so there's more barking dogs. So how we got around that was we did do a room crossover, if you remember this paper. It was in JVM, I think about 7 years ago. But what we were able to show in that one is that the kitties that were having about on average, and by the way, guys, this is a room effect, not an individual animal effect. So we were comparing between the rooms when they were on Fortiflora versus the placebo. But as you can see with the set of bars on the far right, when we pulled all the data together over that 60 days, 30 days one room swap over for 30 days, it was strongly significant. And that's one of the bigger numbers of animals in probiotic studies right now, just because we had, a couple hundred cats in the rooms over that time period. So we felt that was pretty good evidence that in a stressful environment, perhaps effect on the microbiome by that particular probiotic might actually give a benefit. And honestly, I'm always just trying to decide, is it worth $1 a day? Or $1.10 or €1.10, whatever it costs in most of Europe, fairly inexpensive in the United States. But that's still money. And certainly for a shelter, that might be a big deal if it doesn't work. Certainly with my pet owners, I'd like them to have their money spent on good things. But that was a little bit of the earlier work that made me feel that, perhaps using a probiotic in some of my diarrhea cases might have some at least field clinical work that supports that recommendation. This work you can pull off of their website in the United States, but Gail, their bacteriologist, is going to publish this soon. In fact, she's already written a draft of it, and I'm going to be one of her ghostwriters with her. But it was kind of interesting. We tend to think about constipation in the old kitties, but some of those taste tester kitties, they do adopt all their cats at the end, just like CSU does. Bottom line is some of them do get a softer stool, and they've been living inside. They're not parasitic animals. And the darker the bars, the firmer the stool. And Gail was able to show in some of those taste tester kitties that Fortiflora improved their stool character. So basically, they have the one kind of acute diarrhea from the shelter work that I did, and then this would be, I guess, classified as perhaps a chronic idiopathic diarrhea, some evidence that perhaps that probiotic works. Kudos to our friends at Nutramax. This one was funded by Nutramax and done at Colorado. You might know David Tweet, our liver specialist. Craig Webb was one of our residents that stayed on. He likes gastroenterology, and then, of course, I do gastroenterology, so we all align with different companies. So Craig did this one with Nutramax. And this one, the level of evidence, you might say, is just a little bit lower because it was an open trial. Basically, client-owned cats with chronic diarrhea that you just feed a probiotic and the owner provides the fecal scores and things. But the hallmark findings were they dropped from about 6.6 on a 7-point Nestle scale, 7 being water. They dropped from about a 6.6 to about a 4.4 over the 2-month study. And they also had about 70% of the owners say they were satisfied. And as you guys know, I would guess most of us support a placebo effect in owners to be on average about 30%. Based on some of the big meta-analyses, studies in people, it looks about 30% chance that they're going to say it worked just because you did something, like putting oregano in their left ear. Works 30% of the time. But in this case, it was more like 70%. So kudos to another evidence that a probiotic might work. So we continue to go on then. Obviously, we get a new cycle of residents and shelter people that are training with us. And so we're coming up with other ideas. So I wanted to show you, at least in the English language, and if I miss any papers, please correct me during the break. But the first two that I know of that actually looked at, can we lessen a side effect due to antibiotics? This one we did with Jan. Thank you again for the collaboration, my friend. This one we were very curious, and Purina wouldn't let me do it, at least not with their money. These are cats that were perfectly healthy that we wanted to give them diarrhea. You can't do it. And I'm very proud of them for those standards. But I went ahead and funded it through the Center for Companion Animal Studies. And I believe, Jan, you did your part for free as well. So thank you so much for Texas A&M doing this with it. Hey, I don't know what you guys thought about clavulanic acid diarrhea or how often you think it happens. Emily, I don't know if you're in the room, but Dr. Cross and I were trying to come up with the design. Even though they couldn't fund it, I wanted her expertise as a practitioner as well. We estimated 40% would get clavulanic acid diarrhea. Look at the numbers. 23 of 27 cats got a 5, 6, or a 7 when we administered clavulanic acid twice a day on label. You know why she and I thought it was 40%? Is because most of us, if it's a toxicity, we only think about it if the owner calls to complain, right? Yeah, and with clumping litters, a 4, which we didn't even call diarrhea in this study, a 4, a regular layperson would never notice. But even with a 5, which all my clients would know that's diarrhea, they don't call to complain because with clumping litter. And veterinarians, I think we're a little bit different than owners. We like looking at the stool when we're cleaning it. Owners are doing this. Yeah, so I was quite impressed about how many cats get clavulanic acid diarrhea. That ties into some of our judicious use of antibiotic lectures that we'll do in another forum. But point is, we were able to, by giving them the probiotic, and this was Enterococcus faecium SS68, the Fortiflora bacterium, we were able to improve their fecal scores by pre-treating. You know, we also argued, should we give the probiotic first or the antibiotic first? In this case, the beta-lactams actually kill Fortiflora, so we knew we probably shouldn't give them at the same time. We did ultimately read all the human papers, which are kind of all over the place. Half of them do it before the antibiotics, some do after. We chose arbitrarily to go ahead and try to fit with somebody's maybe their work schedule. You know, if you or I, dermatology uses a little clavulanic acid, you know, if we were to prescribe that antibiotic and trying to lessen the side effects, we thought maybe what would work, especially with 2 family members both working, is that you'd get up, feed your probiotic with the meal, go take your shower, you know, get dressed and everything, come back and give the first dose of antibiotic. So in this case, we separated by 2 hours. And you can see that the Fortiflora group, we had no 7s. Okay, we had some 7s in the placebo group, but none in the probiotic group. And then if you just look at the cumulative total over the whole study, it was a 11-day study. We did Fortiflora for 14 days, did clavulanic acid for 7. But if you just look at the cumulative data, the average stool character was better if you were fed the probiotic. So to me now, as an internist that does use oral antibiotics, I would consider using something that costs another $1.10 a day to try to lessen a common side effect, to lessen suffering in my patient that I was actually inducing with the antibiotic. So that's our story at CSU on that particular one. And then Jan mentioned it in his talk earlier today, but just wanted to reemphasize the microbiome diversity scores and things are quite fantastic because now we have some things we can look at. But this was interesting because we didn't do metabolomics on this one, just the microbiome diversity stuff with the genes. So this was kind of cool because it's one of those examples that we saw what appears to be a clinical effect, but the microbiome diversity scores lag behind. So something good is happening even prior to us having a reequilibration of those bacterial numbers. And then again, kudos to another company. This happened to be the Nutramax folks. You might know Jackie Whittemore, the lead author on the end. Jackie was one of my residents years ago. She went on to do this work and showed that she could lessen clindamycin vomiting by pre-treating with Nutramax's product. I believe this was probably Probioble DC, but it was interesting because they were able to lessen vomiting, but it didn't change their fecal scores. And so I came up with one of those, just to remind you guys, Marge Chandler's little paper, All Probiotics Are Not Created Equally. It really is amazing because, as you guys know, the Nutramax product has an Enterococcus faecium, which we showed in the previous study that Enterococcus faecium SS68 was able to change diarrhea scores. Well, just to remind you, it's a difference at the strain level, guys. And Nutramax isn't Fortiflora plus other bacteria. It's a different Enterococcus faecium. We have no idea if it treats diarrhea because they've never studied it independently. So point is, when I see this type of work, then I tend to pick the products that prove that they did something, and then you reward that company by that purchase because that's how they get research dollars to give you new products. You know, so if we say, oh, look at that, probiotics help antibiotic diarrhea, and buy lactobacillus at the health food store, then the whole ship's going to quit moving forward. The companies that actually give us companion animal research need to be rewarded with our business so that they give us more products. We tend to buy all compounded drugs in America, which I know you don't in Europe, but we have compounding pharmacies on every street corner. Compounders aren't funding new research, and so I tend to use products that companies prove that their stuff actually works. And then the last, I've got about 9 minutes, I think, and that'll be perfect timing to get Ebenezer up here for a good lecture. I just wanted to share a couple of things. This is an emerging field, the immune modulation part. And I'm happy that Jan and I are here together because our two groups have done a little bit of this work, either together or separately. So if you have any questions, some things we won't be able to talk about, obviously, because they're still double secret, but we'll give you as much information as we can. The punchline is going to be those two animals. And so the punchline is we have been able to speed the resolution of therapeutic response to Demodex. Obviously, a probiotic by itself wouldn't be studied. Those animals are suffering. Bravecto is a miracle. But the point is that we can speed resolution, perhaps. But more importantly, it's a model to show that a probiotic might actually have an immune modulating effect on the T helper cell level. And so that's the punchline. That particular study was with SF68. I'll show you at the end. And then there's one of those herpes kitties from the Fortiflora lessening reactivation of herpes during the stress model. So again, I guess I'm going to be a pro that there is some data that we can, via manipulation of the microbiome, actually cause an effect that would either lessen, in this situation, the two great papers that have been used with this Viomvet in those animals with suspected inflammatory bowel disease. Really good evidence at the tissue level, guys. These are well done, which I guess I have to say again, because Jan is on those studies. Anyway, really good work if you haven't read those. I can't tell you what we're doing, but I can tell you how excited I am about it. Yeah, different bacteria potentially doing different things. Pretty good data in people. There are 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different atopy type studies in humans. The different bacteria might actually dampen those pruritic responses. And this was just one of the veterinary ones. Again, if any of these authors are here, congratulations. But I wanted to bring this one up because I think Zoetis, for example, fantastic. CellCep, Apoquel, we've done a lot of that cyclosporin work. We did the toxoplasma work for Novartis when they brought cyclosporin to cats. All that stuff is quite interesting, I think, to most of us that would be at an internal medicine meeting. But it's really cool to see that, what if we could lessen those drugs? And not have to give a monoclonal antibody injection monthly. That's the kind of work that I think's really excited about probiotics, is they may not be able to control some of the degrees of inflammation that you and I see as internal medicine interested people. But if we could, as adjuvant therapy, actually lessen other drugs that we use all the time. I can't even tell you how many times I've prescribed prednisolone now in a 38-year career. Point is that if we could lessen drugs, that would be fantastic. So here's the paper that Christoph and Jaleel showed me. I think it was at BSAVA. It was a preprint, so it hadn't come out yet. They came up to me after probably doing a cat respiratory lecture. They came up and said, hey, would you like to read this paper? We've got this new probiotic coming out that probably has immune modulatory capabilities, perhaps being an immune enhancer. And so if you guys don't remember this one, they fed just healthy beagle puppies, vaccinated, all that stuff, showed some non-specific things with increased in total IgA and feces over time. And the scale will be the same, the lower axis, all these studies. They did this over weeks, looking to see could it be an immune health type supplement. And then if you take a quick look, especially at the far right 2 charts, again, this is Enterococcus faecium SF68, the strain specific to Purina, they were actually able to show, a differentiation in basically higher distemper virus titers over time. They stayed up. They didn't boost higher, but they stayed up better. Now, those B cells that are in the dogs that dropped, those animals are still protected against distemper. They weren't trying to say you needed to vaccinate and give a probiotic. This study is to say, is there any evidence for immune modulation? So look at it as an immunity paper. And, when people ask me about probiotics and health, I definitely want Anna Maria's probiotic. I'm going to start tomorrow. I need that one badly. But the point is that this is just to prove the hypothesis. But look at that paper. You guys are scientists. Did you immediately look at the number of weeks and say, well, that's fantastic. It looks like it supports immune health. But if you're treating a chronic UTI or a chronic skin infection, you say, 10 weeks. Shit, I don't want to wait 10 weeks, to get that immune stimulating response. And so that data was quiet for a while. And I asked Ebenezer and Jaleel and the team of immunologists at Purina, I'm like, well, did you test between week 0 and week 10? Because there are a few differentiators. And the answer was no. And so I think they had a good year one year. And I said, well, how about throwing a few bucks to Colorado State University and letting us do it again, just with healthy beagles again, but start testing a little bit earlier? Because if I wanted to potentiate ehrlichiosis or, the other stuff that I have to treat, if I wanted to potentiate those things better, I'd like to see that it might kick in a little bit faster. So this was just a before and after study. Same dogs, same 7 dogs. They were just left over from something. And by the way, we do adopt all of our research animals. So if you would like a research beagle, swing by Colorado after skiing this year, and I'll give you a beagle or 2. And in fact, if I can get people to go into our legal marijuana stores, maybe have them eat one of those magic gummy bears, they'll take 3 beagles. It's amazing. Now, the point is that these dogs were perfectly normal, housed. They're kind of boring. Their immune systems don't see a lot of things because they've been raised in the buildings. But in this particular case, we supplemented and showed with the whole non-specific mitogen stimulation pathway with CON-A that those positive responses were occurring as early as 4 weeks. Then we showed with B cell stuff, again, just like Jaleel had shown, it's quite a potent B cell stimulant. So you'd want to think about that within what uses you would use it for. But that data was pretty strong. Then we also saw some effects on a variety of different T lymphocytes. And so we were quite excited because in the earlier study weren't as many helper cell type changes or suppressor cytotoxic cell changes that we found either numerically or statistically different. So when you see this paper this year, hopefully the reviewers will work through it with us. We think we now have evidence in normal dogs that it actually might do something as early as 4 weeks. And as you guys probably always second guess your own research, my biggest second guessing on this one is why didn't I bleed them on week 2? Duh. I wrote the design. So that's my fault for not bleeding them on week 2. I probably should have checked. So now I don't know where the effects started, but we have some pretty good effects by 4 weeks. So that's where the Demodex pit bull study came from. This is a poorly understood breed. Obviously, if they're managed appropriately, they can be good pets. And so we picked them on purpose. One, there are many of them in Colorado. We have lots, and I wanted it to be a standardized, generalized Demodex model. I didn't want to have focal Demodex dogs, obviously, because they often get better. And I didn't want to have multiple different breeds because maybe there's something specific about this terrier breed. But those are the before and after of 3 of the animals that you'll ultimately see in the paper. We were attempting to do a slow kill, and so we did not use Bravecto. In this case, we actually used Advantage Multi. But remember, what we're trying to show is an immunological effect. So I wanted a slow kill. I might not have been able to tease out a change immunologically if we used a drug that could kick in after 1 or 2 doses. So if you're looking at this saying, Lappin, why did you use an inferior drug? It's because it's not a Demodex study. It's can we enhance the immune system study, which is why we used Advantage Multi. So I look forward to you guys seeing the whole paper. We did everything known to mankind that we can do immunologically, at least at CSU. And just one little teaser graph for today. The bigger the bar, the better the response. In this case, the open bars being Fortiflora. Yeah, I think we're going to have to combine this pilot with the healthy dog data because it's quite difficult to do the field studies with the Demodex dogs. So we are going to try to publish it. Experiment 1, showing the healthy beagle effect. Experiment 2, trends towards clinical and mite responses. But it was enough for me to say, hey, hopefully I can get into their pocket to do some other studies like that whole superbug urinary tract infection thing, other chronic pyodermas. I think there's certainly room in this space because this probiotic seems to have immune modulating capabilities on the upswing side of things. And then the last one, since I've already described this, I won't belabor it because we're right on schedule for Ebenezer to start getting ready to come up and talk about colostrum. But again, this one has been a bane of my existence. We've done many herpes studies over the years. We all know that lysine isn't very effective, even for, we know it's not a treatment, but lysine's even not very effective for keeping them in remission. So we needed something else. And that's why I've been calling this my new lysine. Because when I have that kind of low-grade, smoldering upper respiratory tract infection kitty, certainly not even close to the threshold for expensive cidofovir or difficult to administer famciclovir, you know, that herpes cat that's kind of in the middle. Well, why not use something that tastes good? And Fortiflora, of course, is a little bit easier to give than lysine as a dose. Please remember, if you keep using lysine, it does need to be a dose. Feeding it as nibbles or mixed in with food is totally ineffective. Arguably, it might be effective as a dose, but I tell you what, it's a lot easier to put something that has a hydrolyzed chicken and liver product that makes it taste better. And in fact, you guys are going to love our CKD paper. We have one almost finished where we've been feeding cats with kidney disease, either probiotic with Fortiflora or the placebo. Hold that thought until next time I see you. But here's the conjunctivitis score data during the equilibration versus stress period in the cats that were on the Fortiflora versus the placebo. It was enough to make me try that one when I'm doing a wellness exam and they've got just mild inflammatory disease, upper respiratory. Why not give it a try for a month? I think you're going to have to give that whole month. So when I do that, I'm going to sell a box of it, and then we'll see what happens after that first 28 to 30 days of being ready to go to the second month. Because again, these immune effects may take 4 weeks to start. And so you might have to be prepared for 8 weeks to see how well it might immune modulate. And we're trying to work out the design on stomatitis as our next design with this particular product. So hopefully that was worth your time, guys. Again, it's always quite an honor to get to come to Europe and share some of our information, catch up with old friends, and look forward to the question period as well as to the social time later tonight. Thank you so much.